This morning we continue in our study of James. We are in chapter 5. James chapter 5. Last Lord's Day morning we talked about verses 1 through 3, where James is talking about the misuse of riches. He says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last day that you have stored up your treasures." And in that we talked about the reality of having the blessings that God bestows upon us in the world, the financial blessings, the material blessings. And the key factor is, it's not wrong to have those things, it's how we utilize them. And all the things that we receive in this world should be that which is used to glorify God. And we gave illustrations of those who had many riches and was very wealthy, and how in that blessing they glorified God in what they received. On the other hand, as we note here, these individuals were not doing that. They were having difficulties with the collection of material things. And that kind of gets back to the idea of those who wanted to be teachers. They want prominence, and many times because of their prominence, they gained wealth. And we see that here in the first century, and it's just as applicable today in our world. People who want to be important, they want to have that important position, but they do that more for the idea of obtaining material goods. We also noted that all the material goods that we receive in this world stays in this world. And that's a reality that many people need to come to the understanding of. I know I always make the little story or the joke about the fella that he's got all his material possessions in the U-Haul and they got it tied on behind the hearse, you know. He's not taking any of it with him. We will bring what we will leave with what we brought. Let's put it that way. We brought nothing and we will leave with nothing. The key factor is, as we noted, was where do we store up our treasures? Is it in this world or is it in the heavenly abode? Now, as we get to verse 4, he talks about one of the difficulties, I guess we might say, that these who are very wealthy had. And that was they were not taking care of their laborers. He says in verse 4, James chapter 5, "Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your field, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvest has reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath." Now, James has called upon those who have set their minds upon the riches of the world to weep and howl, as we noted there in verse 1. And because of the misery of the eternal judgment that they face, they are in essence cheating those who work for them, the laborers. He notes here that these laborers mowed the field. They harvested the crop. And he had been withholding or withheld the pay, the compensation for their labor. Now, the word that we note here that is called withheld denotes to defraud, rob, or despoil. So if we cheat those that are laboring, then in essence we are stealing from them. We are robbing from them. And it is evident within our world even today that many individuals who are in positions of, I guess importance would be a word that I could use, but in those places of higher offices, say for instance we have a corporation, and those that are in the hierarchy, they're always wanting to cut costs. And 90% of the time, well, I shouldn't put a percentage on it, but a percent of the time, they cut costs by getting rid of manpower or hiring of people. Many of these companies, they only pay their employees a very limited amount, as low as they can go. And the sad thing, the reasoning behind this is that they might get bigger bonuses at the end of the year for the upper echelon of these companies. And I understand that companies need to make money. I was watching a video this morning talking about some of the major retailers in our country and how they are struggling. And the reasoning is that number one, people don't have the money to spend on their products. And number two, the way of marketing and buying today has changed. And these are, that I was talking about, are brick and mortar buildings and some of the large companies. But also some of these large companies, they have a great turnover in employees. And you always wonder about a company that has a great turnover of employees as to why. Well, a lot of the reasoning is they don't take care of employees. An employee is just a number. They come in, they do what they're supposed to do, and they leave. Anymore in our world today, it seems like companies don't want anything but part-time employees. And the reasoning behind that is they don't have to pay them as much. They are able to withhold from them. They don't have to pay as much taxes on that individual if they are part-time. They don't have to have any of the benefits that used to go with them. I remember our parents, many of them may have worked for a company for 40 years, 30, 40 years, same company. And they come to that point in time that they no longer could work for that company or desired to work for that company, and they had this thing called retirement. And the company had put back funding for their retirement, but that's not a reality in our society today. Companies don't want to have retirements for people. They just want to use them and to get what they can out of them. One of the things that concerns me in our world is these positions, or what we might call jobs, that are being liquidated by mechanical things. In our day, it was mechanical things. Now it's AI. It's not going to be long before, well, it is here now, that you go to the store and you won't see a person in that store. And a lot of these stores are going to come to a point that they close at a certain time of the night. Robots will stock the shelves. And if you even get to go into the store, You collect your items and you can walk out because it's all AI, artificial intelligence. They check what you put in your basket and you just walk out the store. You don't see anyone. And most of us are familiar with the so-called self-checkouts. Well, what does self-checkouts do? It gets rid of people. You know, and I struggle with that. I don't use self-checkout. And we have a store there. At our town. They have 4 self-checkouts and 1 checkout place.
Is that that new dollar store?
Yep.
You're talking about your new dollar store?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Well, up there on the one that you can check out with some person, they have a pig.
What?
A pig. And you got to go up there and you got to squeeze that pig to get that one person that's working in that store to come from whatever they're doing to check you out. I am a pig squealing, punching dude. I guarantee it. I don't like those things. I think it's wrong, but that's the way our world is moving. And my question is why, or what are people going to do for a job? What are people going to do for a job whenever these companies, they don't want to pay laborers? They don't want to pay people. I remember when I went to work at one grocery store back in the day that they had a service counter. Remember the markets with service counters? Had all the meat in this big old counter in the front, and you had to walk up there, and then that guy said, "I want a pound of that there hamburger meat right there." You had to dip it out and weigh it up there and wrap it up. Remember those? We had that. Man, that was a chore. That was work. I'd have to stay half the night cutting meat so I could wait on customers the next day. But we ended up getting a self-service counter. I was still back there doing it, but I worked during the day preparing and filling that counter all day long. Now, they don't even cut meat at most grocery stores. You take Walmart, for instance, they don't cut meat in there at all. It all comes prepackaged, every bit of it. And they just don't do that anymore. Well, that takes away jobs. And I don't know, I just wonder, you've got to make a living doing something. And if there's not a job there, you can't make a living doing anything. So, something to think about. Now, back to these individuals that we're talking about here in verse 4. These people were so heartless that they accepted the labor. They accepted those who mow the field. They accepted those who harvested the crops. They just didn't pay them. They weren't paying those individuals appropriately. Now, God condemns this type of behavior. Look with me, if you will, into the Old Testament, into Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19. And we'll drop down to verse 13. Leviticus 19:13. He says, "You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning." Now, the time period of this writing, people were doing day work. They went out and they worked all day and they were paid that evening, and they could go and buy whatever they needed to feed their families that night. And, you know, I can remember people that would go to the lumber yard or down to the co-op, and they would sit around and wait for day work. Y'all remember that? Guys doing that? I do. Yeah. They'd go out and work a day. They'd take a job anywhere. It didn't matter what it was. I've kind of been
in the city.
Huh?
You still got that in the city.
Yeah. I've taken some of those jobs. Whenever, when we lived in Denver, they had these companies that had people, and they did day work. An employer would call this company and say, I want 2 people for 3 days. And they're called temps, temporary companies. And I know Linda worked for one of those temporary companies a little bit when we were living there. And there was a few times whenever I was not in school that I worked for that temp company. And I know I had this one job counting posters. They were big old posters, and I had to count them and put them in a box. And this was, you know, minimum wage, but it was a job. I mean, I was making a little extra. For us, we needed it, you know. And this guy comes along and he says, you know, I'm going to hire a full-time person, and it's between you and this other fella. And I said, give him the job. He needs a full-time job. I was in school. I said, besides, you know, I'm a heavy equipment operator. I said, I'm just doing this for a little extra money. So the guy got the job, and praise the Lord for that, you know. But sadly, we cannot keep back what is owed others. Let's look again in the Old Testament to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 22, 13.
Jeremiah 32?
Jeremiah 22, 13. Jeremiah 22, 13. It says, woe to him who builds his house without righteousness, and his upper rooms without justice, who uses his neighbor's service without pay, and does not give him his wage. We don't use others without either paying them or reciprocating in some way. I'll tell you what, I do a lot of things for a lot of folks that I don't need any pay for, but if they want to do something nice for me later, that's great. Pass it forward. Do something nice for somebody else. But if we make a deal that I'm going to do such and such for a price, then we expect to receive that compensation. Let's look at Malachi chapter 3, verse 5. Malachi chapter 3, verse 5. It says, then I will draw near to you for judgment, and it will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against those who swear falsely, and against those who oppress the wage earner in his wages, the widow and the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien, and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. again oppress the wage earner with his wages. And we've all heard stories, and I think somebody mentioned it last week when we was talking about this. There have been instances where a company would hire workers, but the workers weren't able to travel to locations other than locally to purchase the goods and services that they needed. And the company had a store. And by the time the individual worked a week, all the money, guess where that went? To the company store. So the company's getting back all that money through that store and supplying goods. Now that could be a good thing if the things that they were purchasing were at a great discount. But back in the day, that wasn't the situation. They were keeping people enslaved. That's just about all you could call it, was enslaved. Let's look at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. And we'll drop down to verse 22. Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Now, in this context, it talks about relationships. And it talks about the relationship between slaves and masters. And we can apply this to workers and bosses, for a better word. 22. Colossians 3. It says, slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequence of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. When I grew up, and I was working for someone, I gave my all to that individual. And we used to, like, say for instance, there was 2 or 3 of us working on a job. We would try to outwork one another. We tried to overdo. And we would work hard all day long. We would try to do more than somebody else. But that reality is not a truism today. It's just the opposite. People go in and they say, I'm going to do a whole lot less than anybody else. Whatever I can get by with, that's the least I'm going to do. It's not the way it was whenever I was growing up. We always got busy, and we always took care of our stuff and did more. And this is an old cowboy saying, but I always rode for the brand. In other words, I was loyal to the company that I was working for, the people that I was working for. And I guess most of the folks that I ever worked for, they were loyal to us. Now, today, I work for the brand. You know what my brand is that I work for? That right up yonder. That's the one I work for. I work for the brand. But sadly, loyalty between companies and laborers, it's not there anymore. I mean, the company don't care about their people. And that's why people don't care about their company. And, you know, I've seen situations in our world today where somebody gets put in a position over another group of people and makes it so much worse than it was to begin with. And that's the kind way of saying that sometimes bad management destroys a company. And people are put into positions not because they could be good in that position, it's because of who they are, what they know, or etc. We've all seen that situation. So we need to understand that when we do a day's work, we need to put in a day's labor. And we need to expect a day's pay. And we need to receive that. And whatever we say that we can do that for, that's what we need to do it. I seen a thing the other day where they was wanting to hire someone to do some cleaning, so a janitorial position. And this was in a meat processing facility. And some of us have been in meat processing facilities, and they wanted you to clean everything. That includes the cutting and wrapping area and the back part. Anyone ever seen the back part? It ain't too nice. It's kind of gory out there. But they wanted somebody to do that. Well, I mean, that's a job. And if that's their thing, that would be a great job. The problem was that they weren't offering enough. Let's put it that way. They were just kind of offering minimum wage. Well, if I needed a job and needed to eat, that'd be one thing. I'd probably take it. Most of us remember when the oil field crashed back in '82. And we were making over $100 an hour. We were doing pretty good. And our time started whenever we got in the truck to leave the house, and but when we got home, our time was closed down. We were making over $100 an hour. Now that included 2 hands and equipment, but that's still pretty good in '82. Well, the oil field crashed, and there was no work. And if there's no work, there's no pay. And for some reason, all that equipment sitting there doesn't make any money, can't support itself. So I did whatever I could to feed our family. I know during that time period, I did a lot of handyman work for people there in our community. If they needed something fixed at the house or whatever, I did it. If they needed a little something done under the house, I worked on that for them. I even painted some houses. We did whatever we could just to get by. And it was fine. You know, we weren't making $100+ an hour, but yet we were eating. But sadly, so many today, they don't even want to work. They just don't want to work. When my Bible teaches if you don't work, you don't eat. And we never relied on anything or anyone. We always took care of ourselves the best that we could. But as those that may be paying someone to work for us, we need to be those who take care of the deal that we made with them and give them their wages. And take care of people. You know, we need to be those who take care of one another. He concludes this passage talking about the Lord of the Sabbath. And this is only found one other time in the New Testament, and that's in Romans 9:29, where it says, "And just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of the Sabbath had led us to a posterity, we should have become like Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah." And that's in Isaiah 1 and verse 9. Thought is that God is Lord of all nations and thereby all powerful. So God gives to those that are His what He promises. And if we are hiring someone or employing, I can't even say it this morning, we need to fulfill our obligations to that person. And that goes throughout the world. But a lot of times it doesn't happen. So let's begin there next Lord's Day morning.